to be April Wells. Hello, thank you so much. And she will be followed by Dr. Jaime Castellano. And if you have any questions, be sure to add them to the Q&A, and we will try to have some time at the end if we can to answer them. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to join with this opportunity as we unpack addressing disproportionality in gifted education. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. I'm April Wells, and I serve as the gifted coordinator in School District U46. I'm in Illinois, just outside of Chicago. Additionally, I have the privilege of serving on the board of directors for both the Illinois Association for Gifted Children, as well as the National Association for Gifted Children. Another slice of the pie, which informs the way I lead and learn in gifted education, is through serving in capacity as an educational consultant and the co-founder of Well-Suited Solution Limited Liability Corporation. Grateful for this opportunity, would love to maintain some level of connection with you. You can follow me on Twitter, share any thoughts, drop ideas and comments and responses there, and we'll take this experience to continue to heights. So I have something here to the right of my picture on this opening slide. The quality of your thinking is revealed through the quality of your questions. I certainly believe that this work of addressing disproportionality in gifted isn't always about knowing the answers. And hopefully that does give some of you reason for pause. When we look at this lens of shifting practices, changing minds, and addressing disproportionality in gifted, many of our improvements and enhancements come from knowing the correct questions to ask. So let's allow ourselves to interrogate ourselves, interrogate our policies, interrogate our practices, and to ultimately develop systems of support and planning that represents inclusive excellence for all gifted learners. So as we move on into the next step of this, when we think of equity in gifted education, we certainly, must keep in mind that gifted programming is only as equitable as students from the most marginalized groups experience it to be. The work of equity is about centering the voices of those who have been pushed to the margins. And when we see this through a strengths-based approach, we recognize, first of all, that our scholars from all backgrounds have talents, have abilities, and deserve to be served in a way that will allow them to match their academic and social and emotional trajectory. This is our responsibility. For me, this work certainly represents the most delicate of a collision of my personal and professional pursuits. My charge to myself, and hopefully you're willing to embark upon this same level of understanding, is that we endeavor to leave gifted education better than we found it. So that acknowledges that there's been a significant lift around the work already. Prior to, some of us arriving on the scene, joining, or when we came, there have been significant moves of leading the work, lifting the work, and we must acknowledge those who have led the way and those who are continuing to serve and blaze trails so that we can center the voices of those who have been pushed to the margin and implement services that are going to represent our belief and assertion that giftedness occurs in all populations. So we move on. Before we really dive into this, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this time in our Imagined community here with Dr. Castellano, we have to define equity. Before we can talk about underrepresentation, we need to really define what these terms are. So equity, when we think of equity in gifted spaces, when we think of the outcome, and I'd like to say, my charge when I look at this work is representing this work, presenting it in a way that we define equity so that we lift the burden of remedying and removing barriers. We lift it, we remove it from the shoulders of those who have been marginalized, and we flip it so that we have a system focus. We look through the lens of what has gone awry in our system to perpetuate underrepresentation or overlooked populations in gifted education. Namely, we know when we think about this, we recognize culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse students represent a very significant amount of the population of US students in classrooms today. The unfortunate reality that we also recognize is that the degree to their participation and involvement in gifted programming is not representative of their population in our schools and our district. So equity would say that we push ourselves to an understanding where we implement a plan through a systemic way that addresses and removes and dismantles barriers that precludes certain groups of students from accessing programming that we know at the most fundamental level of our understanding that they deserve a seat at these tables. So for me, this is a work that's really, something that's, finding myself in the work. When we see the work of gifted education, I grew up in a household that was economically vulnerable. And let me tell you, I absolutely abhor the term poverty, kids in poverty or impoverished, because that actually strips away the capital that these students still possess. They may be from households where economically, there's some vulnerability, but the prowess, the talent, the skills, the innovation that is represented in these populations is enough to give us to be able to really revisit the way we see this. So when we define equity, when we think of this, it means that we're looking to go beyond just achieving levels of participation by diverse groups in programming to this space of inclusive excellence. So that as a result of experiencing gifted programming or specialized services and the such, students will have an outcome that shows that they were welcomed in a way, that they were acknowledged, they had windows and mirrors, they had opportunities that valued and saw the funds of knowledge they bring onto the experiences. Moving on to the next piece in here. When we think about our identity informs how students show up and do work. It informs the way they do school. If you were to think of your own identity, I would ask that you would list perhaps your top 3 identifiers. Who are you? Who are you? Because when we see this, that we understand the complexity and the beauty, and the beauty where our intersectionalities of identities actually resides, informs the way systems implement strategies and equity plans so that we can have an equity plan in each school district that is more than banquet chicken of public education. And this requires an understanding of the self. So as you think about your top 3 identifiers that would be used to describe you, how have you gained insight to your students' lived experiences? Then I would ask that you also juxtapose what maybe conjecture or prediction would give you to say about your students' identifiers. Where's the similarity with those? And where are the differences? Because in many instances, while yes, within gifted education, we know that there is systemic racism that has been complicit for things that we've done in gifted education, the cultural conflict also has run this interference, which has allowed us to have these imbalanced systems where we're not seeing and serving all students. But to look at this through a practical lens, I'm a practitioner. At heart, I am an educator, serving in the capacity of providing leadership opportunities for teachers and administrators who are in the trenches on a daily basis, trying this work out and revising and revisiting so that we can do a better job on today than we did on yesterday. So this intersectionality of our students' identities, how does it impact the way they do school? And to what degree does our identification protocol, does our recruitment effort, does our retention effort, does our implementation of curriculum and instruction reflect the intersectionality of their identities? So as we move forward, keep that in mind. Got identity? Think about that. There are blind spots. This work really causes us to recognize that the potential for cultural conflict exists. When we think of the gifted educator workforce, And that's even moving beyond just general education and public education, seeing the educator workforce and the seemingly disconnected representation by demographics compared to the students we serve. That poses an opportunity for us to see where the cultural conflict really arises. When we recognize, research shows us that simply by having a Black teacher, Black students are 3 times more likely to be identified for gifted programming. Well, we have not taken the steps in the immediacy to address that gifted educator workforce challenge that we have. And I can certainly pause and insert right here in a commercial. We have to think about what fueled that disproportionate number of educators from diverse backgrounds. Go back to Brown versus Board of Education. What happens with Black educators? And that will help us to understand why we are where we are today. So do you see what I see? When we look at this representation by the percentage of students and their racial or ethnic designation, according to the National Center for Educational Statistics, this is from, I believe, 2017, 2018, about 79% of the public school teachers were white. We see then on the next slide, when we think about uncovering blind spots, we can see the percentage and demographics of our student population. I share this when we talk about disproportionality because we have to understand at a systems level, there are certain implementations that we certainly have to be able to address, and we may not necessarily in the immediacy. I'm not giving us a pass, but I'm saying that even while we work to address the diversity of the educator workforce, it is incumbent upon us to do something about serving the students in the seats in front of us. So this is what we look like. This is what it's presenting as. And understanding this helps us to move to knowing what we can do about this to represent gifted populations and having all demographics shown up and served. When we look next, we see among the hidden, invisibility precludes engagement. If our students, our scholars are not seen, are not welcomed, are not brought into educational pursuits in a way that invites the totality of their experience, their personalities, their identities. I feel like I'm getting a little loud here. The passion is certainly there. When we don't do that, we reduce their ability to fully engage. So we know underrepresentation is that disproportionate participation in programming by students from diverse backgrounds. And we can name this thing. We're looking at students who are culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse. We do also understand underrepresentation can be remedied. It doesn't have to go on in perpetuity. This requires, though, a systemic approach to dismantle any system that produces inequities in gifted education. For individuals who have the luxury and responsibility of having a seat at the table, it behooves us to know the questions to ask. When we see the data, who is among the hidden? We know that these students are capable. We know that according to our demographics and our population, they're here on a daily basis. The disconnect comes in how we acknowledge and serve them in programs. As we move from a deficit approach, this requisite component will allow us to redesign gifted programming in a way that we honor our responsibility to start seeing and serving scholars who are sitting in the seats in our classrooms on a daily basis. Again, our work is about reducing invisibility so that our students are seen and that they are invited to participate in programs that match their trajectory. As we move on, we think about this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This work is really the continuation of what we see as our civil rights. And the driver behind this work really translates into us identifying spaces where all learners are welcomed. So we cannot really have diversity, equity, and inclusion without understanding the necessity of the component of the sense of belonging. When we see this work, and when we approach addressing disproportionality, as we understand, much of this work is also about a restorative approach. There has been harm committed against communities for our students who are culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse. As a field in gifted education, we acknowledge we've missed the mark. So part of the restorative work is addressing that and developing systems of support that will provide greater inclusive excellence so that we are addressing the students who have been locked out, lost, and overlooked. This work comes as we address establishing and maintaining rapport, not just with our students, but also reaching into to understand the social, the cultural, and the navigational capital in their communities. Because when you receive me, April, as a learner, an independent, individual, and you don't understand the collective of the group that I represent, you miss out. So the work that we aim has to be one that is structured in a way that we honor the involvement and engagement from the community that's wrapping around these learners. It's manifest in the conversations. Who's involved in the conversations? When we think of this work through the lens of an etic versus an emic perspective, are we learning about the lived experiences of our students solely from what we're reading and research? Or are we actually gaining the insight from what they are telling us, from what they are sharing with us, and then understanding that that funds of knowledge is what we use to deliver instruction at a way that matches their trajectory and allows them to grow at rates that we know that they're able to. This, again, this whole idea when we see diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's representative across all of the work in gifted, your curriculum and instruction, the recruitment and retention of students. Also, when we see the necessity of having requisite trainings for your professional learning for every educator who interfaces with students, not necessarily just your gifted students, because there may be students who have opted out of programming or who have not been identified. And we have a responsibility of having a way to understand how we raise awareness to serve these students. As we move on, we recognize that your voice matters. Part of this work is such an entangling work of advocacy that we have to ask ourselves, what are you willing to do to disrupt oppressive educational practices in gifted education? And if you are interested in finding out what potentially are those systems that are oppressive, I would recommend start with the review of your district or your school's data. Who is missing? If you look at that in alignment with the population for the demographics of your district, you will see very clearly who's among the hidden. And then we start to ask questions. Why aren't they represented? So we start to then really, at a deep level, unpack the identification process. Is it a referral or nomination process? Analyze that data. Who's referring, who's nominating, and who's among the hidden? This notion of missingness, we know the answers. We have the data, we're acquainted with it. So I like to leave always a call to action. In your space of influence, identify the barriers that are blocking CLED students from accessing gifted program. And once you identify those barriers, our charge is dismantle those barriers and access potential. This place of advocacy involves a willingness for us to move to action. Courageous conversations are awesome and they're necessary. Conversations alone won't do this. Translating practices, enhancing our policies, addressing mindsets, being willing to have those conversations that require us to confront beliefs and values that may be aligned in efforts that are really defined by systemic racism in education. That's where we are. Conversations alone will never change the pendulum and move us to the place where we have to be. So your voice matters. More emphatically, your action will matter. So speak up and let's do what's necessary. So I like to think of a 3-2-1. Identify 3 things about your system. Identify 3 things in your system that you would recommend you stop doing in terms of a practice. 2 things that you will start doing, and 1 prevailing question that you have. 3 stop, 2 continue or start doing, and 1 question that really resonates at the heart of this work of equity and gifted education. As we move on, we've talked about, I mentioned, this restorative approach and remedying underrepresentation. There is a necessity that we have anti-bias and anti-Black racism education in gifted spaces so that we can become acutely aware of what has led us here. So to implement changes and strategies to address remedying underrepresentation without understanding the root causes opens us up to landing here again as the pendulum swings. So this work means that, first of all, the human brain is wired to recognize difference. That alone is not the fault. The fault lies when we leave our biases unchecked. When we have unchecked biases, those are the experiences that potentially run the interference for students accessing programming. So this work means that there's a commitment that it's going to just naturally upset the status quo. As we change this dynamic of power and gifted education, and we provide structures that will invite as cultural brokers, we're not coming to save anyone. I am from a group who's been marginalized. I'm not asking anyone to save me. What I am asking is that you be mindful of the barriers that groups that are dominant have constructed, and that we all work to dismantle these barriers. And that does mean, again, upsetting the status quo. So that means that part of this imbalance that we seemingly are dealing with, which is really righting us, this means that we have to prepare everyone to understand what this shift really entails. So this work that's ahead, it's really about changing structures of power and privilege. And to anyone who has—
Sorry to interrupt, 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Super, thank you. All right, so when we understand how we dismantle these systems that have perpetuated inequities and the disparities that historically underrepresented groups, when we eliminate them, then we will see that outcomes by student groups cannot be predicted by that grouping. So when we see this as it is through a social justice lens, and then strategically planning to drive this continuous change, I have a quote that is probably one of my favorites when I think of the work of equity in education, and more specifically in gifted. Equity is achieved when student outcomes are not predicated by gender, race, ethnicity, class, or special needs, and where all students reach a level of efficacy and competence that supports a rewarding and productive life. This requires elimination of the inequities that contribute to disproportionate learning and achievement by students of certain social groups, while ensuring students are prepared for a productive and meaningful life. And I found this from a presentation at the Connecticut Center for School Change on equity. So this work of upsetting the status quo, what we've done has not produced the outcomes that we're all looking to see. That means that we'll take what has worked and we'll continue with that momentum and we'll dig deeper. So as I'm rounding this out, let's look next slide here. Access and potential is about, first of all, recognizing the potential is there and understanding what might be seen as a barrier or what is obscuring identification. English as an additional language is an additive. It is not subtractive. When we value language acquisition and emergent bilinguals and recognize what they are doing while managing, acquiring a language and demonstrating their ability to handle complex thinking across content areas is definitely giftedness. When we see that students from households where they may not have the same socioeconomic status as students who have more accumulated advantage, those previous opportunities that have restricted what they were able to do because of, the opportunity gap, can push us to understand we must see the funds of knowledge. Additionally, recognizing the power in the social and cultural capital. Whose culture matters? In these dynamics, understanding the necessity of psychosocial support and the others, there are a couple pieces there. In my last minute or so, I want to stress talent development is one of the ways we clearly see that we can address disproportionality. Means that we are cultivating the talent that is already there. We acknowledge this talent exists. We provide windows and mirrors. We give students something to see, something to reach for, and we have it as part of a continuum of services. We can kind of get a little wonky when it comes to the label of gifted. Okay, so if it requires that it's a continuum of services, the label, yes, but really it's about the services. If we can provide services, access to the experiences, so we're supporting all learners, then identify, then support some more. I think the next slide is universal screening. Just recognizing every student needs to have access to the candidate pool. That's removing barriers to widen the pool and certainly to increase representation and to really move this needle and get to equity. The use of building level norms. So we have ranked performance within the school building. Let's move to the next slide here. Again, we dismantle these systems that perpetuate inequities. Your advocacy matters. Representation means that the individuals who have the seats at the table have a willingness to ask about those who have been lost, locked out, and left behind. That pushes us to a systemic redesign. And my last slide here is the gifted equity model. As we address these, we recognize barriers which come as cultural perception gaps and all of the other gaps. It's not just about the excellence gap. It's not just about the diverse educator gap. It's even about cultural perceptual gaps. Maybe teachers are seeing students from diverse backgrounds inaccurately. The cultural brokering and the scholarly pursuits, which leads us to opening doors and providing experiences where we have an increase in student sense of belonging and we maximize pursuits and opportunities for all learners. Thank you.
Ms. Wells, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing with us, and hopefully we will have time at the end to do some question and answer time. And Dr. Castellano, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
I certainly appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. Look, April set the bar, no question about it. She's a tough act to follow, but I'm here to tell you that I'm gonna give it my best shot. I'm gonna tell you my version of the truth when it comes to equity and disproportionality in gifted education. And we are trying to do just what I propose on the screen there, to strive to forge a union with purpose, right? And as we begin our work in equity and disproportionality, and as I sat and saw the inauguration of elected President Biden and the young poet laureate, the youth poet laureate Amanda Gorman, I took this excerpt from her poem because I think it speaks to exactly what we're trying to do in gifted education when it comes to addressing issues of equity, inclusion, diversity, and disproportionality, right? So I'm gonna take a couple seconds, man, and check it out. Those are some very powerful words. If we could move on. So when we look at who is underrepresented in the field of gifted education and in other advanced academic programs, you see the laundry list here. And it seems to get longer and longer as we continue to expand what we mean by inclusion, diversity, and disproportionality. But here's what we know for a fact, that special populations of gifted learners are underrepresented in all academic programs. So I would ask you, who could you add to this list from your local context, right? What's happening in your school? What's happening in your district regarding underrepresentations in these advanced academic programs? Let's move on. So we know that in order for us to make any inroads, to make any significant impact in the field of gifted education when it comes to serving special populations, including primarily among them low-income, racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse students. We have to look at the infrastructure. And you see in the right hand of this screen, the infrastructure, the continuum of infrastructure that we see. These are all key players when we address issues of equity and disproportionality in the field that we have devoted our careers and lives to, right? So I ask you, regarding infrastructure and decision-making in gifted education. And I'm asking you to look at this through the lens of what you do, where you're at, your local context, whether it's at the school level, whether it's at the district level, whether it's at the state level, or whether it's at the national level. When we talk about infrastructure, inequity, and disproportionality, which one of those three do you choose, right? Do you choose to issue blame? Do you choose to be proactive, or do you choose to do nothing, right? I think this is a fair question to ask, and I'm confident that our responses differ based on the circumstances that present themselves in our lives in real time with our jobs in the trenches day in and day out. Next slide, please. So you saw that continuum of infrastructure that has a dramatic impact on equity and disproportionality in the field of gifted education. So where is the bottleneck? Where is the chink in the armor? Where does it exist? Where is the hole? So think about your district and how would you answer this question? If you're at the state level or if you're at the national level, where? The question is the same, is the bottleneck, and where is the chink in the armor? I like these kind of open-ended questions, certainly qualitatively oriented, but it allows us to have, I would say, deep conversations. April refers to them as courageous conversations, and I would agree that this would be one of the questions that we would ask to help generate those courageous questions and those courageous discussions. Let's move on. Personally, my commitment and history in the field of gifted education has given me an opportunity, has blessed me really, with the opportunity to be proactive. I am a practitioner at heart. There is not one position in the field of gifted and talented education that I have not been a part of. Anywhere from a classroom teacher of the gifted to an assistant principal and principal evaluating and advocating for my gifted education programs, specifically as it refers to students of color. I've been a district level coordinator and director. I've been a state specialist in the field, primarily in the area of gifted ELL. So I come to you with a wealth of experience and advocacy in choosing to be proactive. So that typically means that I have to collaborate. I have to collaborate with building principals. I have to collaborate with teachers of the gifted, with regular education teachers, bilingual teachers, ESOL teachers, district administrators, superintendents, school boards, right? I've had my hand in every one of those groups. As primarily a practitioner, a school-based and district-based practitioner. So that means that it also informs the type of communication one invests in to be proactive and to advocate for historically underrepresented populations in gifted education. And through that advocacy and through being proactive, this idea of collegiality and developing allies and expanding your web of support, expanding that net to bring in more individuals at all levels, really, including parents, about how important it is that our gifted students who have been historically underrepresented are given access, and that there is, in fact, equity going on in the schools and districts across the country. So let's go ahead and move on. And so April and I are basically giving you the same message, right? La mensaje es igual, which means that the message is the same. El camino es un poco diferente. How we get to the idea of equity and disproportionality, there are multiple pathways, right? April mentioned a few. Here is one that I think makes the biggest change, the biggest effect in identifying and serving special populations of students in gifted education. And that's addressing disproportionality through training and professional development. Without training and professional development, there is no effort to promote equity and disproportionality in the field, because people don't know what they don't know. And through training and professional development, we can give them the tools, the resources that empower them to make a difference in the trenches, in the day-to-day operations of the programs that are set in our public schools, in our charter schools, in our magnet schools, in our private schools across the country. Training and professional development is critical to addressing disproportionality. And I'm going to show you how we do that across 5 very critical areas. Next slide. So here they are, right? Characteristics, assessment, curriculum and instruction, program infrastructure, program evaluation, policy development. When I was asked to be part of this presentation to address disproportionality, my immediate thought was, well, my practical experience at the school and district level, and as a national eminent scholar in the field of gifted and talented education, I've been blessed with the opportunity to train teachers across the world, right? But let's focus here in the United States. And in that training and professional development, I always begin in the area of characteristics, because if teachers don't know what to look for in the low-income, racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse students that sit in their classrooms day in and day out, those kids are never going to be nominated or referred for advanced academic programs like in gifted education. So let's go ahead and dig a little deeper. Let's drill a little deeper into each of these areas. Next slide. So when we talk about training and professional development, and characteristics and identification of special populations, here is what I'm talking about, right? So you heard me say that this is the key to battling disproportionality. And I can tell you from personal experience, as a trainer, as a consultant, as a coach, having been involved in numerous JAVITS grants for the last 20 years, that once regular education teachers get trained, once bilingual and ESOL teachers get trained, we see a dramatic uptick. There's a dramatic increase in the number of special populations of students that are nominated and referred for gifted education programming. And because more of these kids are nominated and referred, we see more kids achieving eligibility status and gaining access to the program. And so what training and professional development does in the area of characteristics and identification is that it certainly empowers teachers with the requisite knowledge to be able to go back into their classrooms and to begin thinking about individual students that they have, that they could nominate and refer to their school and district's child study teams for consideration and from formal evaluation in gifted education. And certainly when we talk about characteristics and identification, there has to be policy, because those of you who are at the district level, at the state and national level, the basic premise is if it's not in policy, it probably is not going to get done, right? So written policy is critical, And towards the end of the presentation, I will give you some sample policy statements that help generate the courageous conversations you need to have with your superintendent and school board around the idea of equity and disproportionality, right? So we begin with the characteristics and identification, critical. Let's move on. So let's take this values vote. And here's the question for your consideration. My district does a good job with professional development and training and gifted education of special populations, right? So it's a yes or no vote. However, I would also ask you to consider a 1 to 10 range, right? With 1 being my district does not offer any professional development and training in gifted education of special populations, with 10 being, yes, it is part of our commitment to equity, disproportionality, and it's written in policy that our teachers will get this training. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your district? All right, interesting conversation I'm sure that we can have about this question. Let's move on. Okay, so we talk about one of the most critical areas to address equity and disproportionality is through this whole idea of assessment. And assessment has been the source of tremendous debate at least since the inception of gifted education. And we can debate when that occurred, but I would say systematically, it was probably in the 70s. But we know that assessment is the overriding consideration that has to be talked about when we look at special populations of gifted students. Just thinking of ELL students off the top of my head, we have to determine, okay, do we test in English? Do we test in Spanish? Do we test with a traditional verbally intensive, language-rich IQ test like the Stanford-Binet or the Wechsler scales? Or do we use non-verbal assessments of intelligence or ability? So we certainly have to consider the individual and the population that we are looking at, right? And it varies from district to district. And the research is very clear, right? That there has to be flexibility of test options. Without flexibility of test options, your district, your school will continue to rely on conventional wisdom and status quo in terms of who gains access to that gifted education programs. And I know in my experience as a school-based, district-based supervisor and administrator in gifted education, I know that it was important for the students that I was working with to be assessed by those adult educators that knew them best, their classroom teachers. And so whenever I engaged in universal screenings, universal testing, we relied on the classroom teachers to administer those ability tests. And they were nonverbal in nature. And as a result of those students already having a connection with their teachers, we were able to identify a lot more students of color and low-income students for participation in programs like gifted education. My friend and colleague, Scott Peters, who is the NAGC Publication Committee Chair and a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, he has done some great writing on how to use different tests and use tests differently, right? With the emphasis being on local norms. The idea is that if you use local norms, you'll always have representation from your student groups that will be part of the makeup of your advanced academic programs. But we also know that the assessment process has to be comprehensive, right? And so you see on the screen what that looks like. And of course, much like through characteristics and identification, there should be written policy on assessment and how that translates to increasing equity and reducing disproportionality in the gifted programs at the local level. So assessment is key. Many of our colleagues in gifted education are like, all right, already, man, let's move on beyond assessment. Because if we continue to think about assessment, we're going to just argue that ad nauseum, right? Or we look through training and professional development to address disproportionality through curriculum and instruction. Okay, so this implies that those kids are already in the program and are sitting in your seats, in your programs and in your classrooms, right? And so to promote this idea of equity, to promote this idea of disproportionality, you can see a laundry list of strategies, processes, and activities that we use that make those students in gifted education feel good about themselves, right? It's a form of empowerment. And right at the top of the list, you see relational pedagogy. And that is the connection, basically, that the teacher has with the students that they are working with day in and day out. And many of those that you see on this list, I have personally used, from gifted kids as young as kindergarten age, all throughout high school. I even use many of these strategies in my work as a professor with my undergraduate and graduate students in education. I use them because they're powerful, and they empower, and they make a difference, and they make those kids feel good, that they have a place at the table, that they have something to offer, that the glass for them is half full and not half empty, that there is a commitment to equity and efficacy and doing what's in their best interest. And that was convenient for us as teachers of gifted, advanced, and high ability students, right? And one thing that I've learned in my experience as a teacher of the gifted, particularly in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade band, is that it's imperative that teaching them and having lessons on perseverance and resiliency is a mandatory strategy, right? You've got to have that as part of your menu of curriculum and instruction. You could be that model for those kids, particularly if you're a gifted teacher of color, right? You can share your story, you can share your journey with the students that you work with. I know that I do as a bilingual Hispanic male, as a scholar and a researcher in the field of gifted education who simply happens to be Hispanic and able to speak Spanish. I'm reaching a certain population of our public school students that have historically been marginalized, right? Many of them are undocumented and disenfranchised, and they particularly need to be taught lessons regarding perseverance and resilience. And you see strategies and processes like storytelling, bibliotherapy, and cinematherapy, songs of hope, inspiration, and efficacy, a lot of qualitatively based strategies that allows us to dig a little deeper in the lives of the students that we work with in order to understand them a little more, right? Understanding their day-to-day life, their day-to-day experiences, their day-to-day struggles, and knowing that you, as a teacher of the gifted, you as a principal of a building that houses gifted programs, you as the district coordinator or director of gifted programs can help inform and educate the teachers that you supervise to make sure that these kinds of experiences are part and parcel or routine of what goes on in your gifted education programs. Of course, relational pedagogy also implies that there is an emphasis on rigor and complexity. And you have to understand that that's important as well. So let's go ahead and move on.
3 minutes remaining.
Okay, so program infrastructure, there you have the continuum of people that are part of program infrastructure. Let's move on. Through program evaluation, there are a number of wonderful tools that many of our gifted education scholars of color have created to help school districts address issues of equity and disproportionality. Donna Ford, Ken Dixon, Joy Davis, so many have joined forces to develop a program evaluation protocol for districts to use that address equity and disproportionality. I have some as well that are in the books that I've written. Next slide, please. So policy development. Okay, if you're into policy and you want to address equity and disproportionality, I'm telling you, these are the 4 areas that you got to concentrate on, right? Setting a vision, identifying standards, ensuring quality, and evaluating progress. I'm going to show you how with an example. Let's move on. So I'm primarily noted in the field of gifted and talented education for my work advocating for gifted Hispanic, Latino, and ELL students, right? And I've been asked time and time again to deliver language that will help a district identify policy for educating Hispanic and Latino students. So here's an example of what a worksheet looks like. This is the opening statement, just very generic, that states the importance of why we need to have a vision for educating this population of students. And you can just eliminate Hispanic and Latino students and put in gifted students. Next slide. And so here are the questions that I love, that I've developed, that are part of this worksheet on developing policy. In this case, simply setting a vision. I have these worksheets for the other policy areas that I mentioned in the previous slide. But I love these questions because they're a combination of open-ended, inquiry-based questions that get the conversation started that are no joke. And others are data-driven and are yes or no. So you have some black and some white and some gray. And these are simply designed, these questions are to get the conversation going, to help narrow down the data and how the data presents itself, with looking at equity and disproportionality through a lens of policy. These are very powerful questions that I would encourage you to consider using in your schools and in your districts to at least start a conversation. Next slide. And so look, the ball is in your court, right? And so the question that I leave you with is, how can you address equity and disproportionality in your school or district, like right now, this year, before the school year ends? What could you do to be that champion, to be that advocate, to be that person that's going to make a difference in the lives of the students that you work with? Look, I know it's not easy, but we got to keep on moving forward. In Spanish, we say, vamos a seguir adelante. We're going to continue to move forward, right? And we would say, bendiciones, blessings to all of you in your work. And I wish you the best of success, and may the force be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castellano.
Right.
That was wonderful. And we do have a few minutes, and I know if you want to look on the Q&A, I would invite, I know that Ken has a couple of questions on here, and I'd love to take a few minutes and have you both answer some of those. I saw that April, thanks for answering one earlier as well. So the first one, and I just have to say thank you so much. Both of your presentations were amazing, and we really appreciate you sharing this important information. So, okay, let's get to a question or two before we have to skedaddle. And Ken says, what's up, my dear friend and equity warrior? Glad you're still on the path. You mentioned training. You've seen it all, but is there anything different or new concerning training that you mentioned? I love you, man.
Yes, actually, there are a few things. And what we see, one of the latest trends, at least in the work that I'm doing, is the training and professional development of building principals and district office administrators. Often those individuals are gatekeepers. And through the training and the experience that I have working with principals and district office administrators outside of gifted education, we see that is a particularly effective strategy to building a network of support, building that infrastructure, because you have to have it at the school level, and you got to have it at the district level. Certainly have to have it at the superintendent's office level and at the school board office. So, bringing superintendents and school boards into the fold, those are the decision makers. Those are the ones who write, develop, and approve policy. That is something new and different that we haven't focused on greatly in the past.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And April, did you want to touch on that one too?
No, I certainly would just like to say that idea around the emphasis of having the policies codified in board policy, very critical piece that allows us to operationalize the work in the absence of, having people who have goodwill at the table making decisions.
So important. And I think we're going to squeeze in, if it's okay, one more question. This one's from Nanette, and she asked, do you recommend books and film clips film or clips of them for different ages? Do you have any ideas and this is for both of you?
I will say this, that I do use a series of what I call old school silver screen films to address issues of equity and disproportionality. Films like Stand and Deliver, Dangerous Minds, Freedom Riders, for example. For younger populations, I would use movies like Matilda, for example. I also am a firm believer in bibliotherapy and using children's literature and young adult literature to make specific points with reference to equity, diversity, inclusion, and disproportionality that generates a very active discussion with our gifted students. An example would be junior grade books, right? It is just one that comes off the top of my head. So yeah, definitely.
April?
I would just say, I think that may be one of the treasures that we can really move to help our understanding when we see the prolific writings by some of our young adult authors now. When we look at some of the ideas and critical elements they're discussing, we think of like a Jason Reynolds, when we think of Woodson, when we think of those. And so finding ways so that we have perspective that's coming from within, from some of these things that these young people are sharing with brilliant minds and allowing us to foster an understanding of how to meet their needs.
Oh, thank you both so much. That is wonderful. I wish we could just keep talking all the time. I really appreciate it. And for the attendees, thank you so much for being with us for this too. Up next at 4 o'clock, we're going to have legislative policy panel with, let's see, Brian Sponsler, Sheila Gallagher, and Julia Link Roberts. So please, in just a couple of minutes, we'll get that going. Thanks so much.